Hello, welcome to the Great Tide of Humanity. I'm going to give everybody just a few minutes to log in, but we're glad you're here. Hello, and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. My name is Charlotte Gilbride, and I am the coordinator of the Nancy R. Chandler Visiting Scholar Program at COCC Foundation. We are super excited to be kicking off this year's programming with tonight's panel discussion. Everyone has had an unusual year thus far, to say the least, so we are especially thrilled that we are able to provide our programming virtually to all of you. We have worked very hard to make it run smoothly, but there may be issues, so please be patient. I know you will. One very exciting thing about being able to offer our program virtually is the participants that are here tonight are from around the country and actually around the world. We have lots of people from the West Coast and of course the East Coast, Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, but we have lots of people from, not lots of people, but we have people from Texas, Iowa, Illinois. We even have someone from Germany and Australia. So I want to welcome all of you to this program tonight. I want to start with a little background on COCC Foundation. COCC Foundation was founded in 1955 and provides scholarships and capital improvements and develops programs that foster COCC student success. We are extremely proud to say that for this current academic year, we were able to award over $1.7 million in student scholarships. As we all know, it's been a tough year, so we're quite proud of that accomplishment. The Visiting Scholar Program was founded in 1985 by Robert W. Chandler Sr. to honor his wife, Nancy. The program brings renowned scholars, lecturers, and experts to our region to provide broad-based programming on a diverse range of subjects, with the goal of stimulating conversation and encouraging thought. So here we are tonight. The Visiting Scholar Program and COCC Foundation work to support the college in all that it does. Central Oregon Community College is the oldest two-year college in Oregon and works diligently to be responsive to our community's needs. COCC offers two-year associate degrees, career and technical degrees, developmental courses, continuing education classes, and industry-specific training programs. We are certainly proud to be part of all that COCC does. I would like to extend a big thank you to the Visiting Scholar Program's annual sponsors. They are Mabel Clark McDonald Fund and the Associated Students of COCC. Without their continued annual support, we would not be able to provide the quality programming that we do for our community and for our students. And tonight we have a special partnership with the Right Connection at Thoreau Farm, and we are lucky to be working with them. And most importantly, for tonight's program, we owe a special thanks to Marjorie Merritt. Marjorie is the reason we are all here tonight. Marjorie, who lives in Bend, has a special place in her heart for Concord, Massachusetts, Henry David Thoreau, and his 1840 contemporaries. She has been dreaming of bringing these talented Concord voices to our area for several years, and tonight it is happening. So thank you so much, Marjorie. I also want to make you aware that we are recording tonight's programming. Our panelists may post links or other resources to the chat function, so be sure to check that. If you have any questions during the program, you may submit them to the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Towards the end, after all of our panelists have spoken, we will do our best to answer all of your questions. We also want to be very respectful of everyone's time this evening. So if you need to leave the webinar, just do so at any time. As I said, we are recording the program. So you will be getting, as a registrant, you will be getting an email link tomorrow with a link to the recording. So you can rewatch it or watch the part that you've missed. And now I want to introduce you to the Executive Director of Thoreau Farm, Margaret Carol Bergman, who will serve as our moderator this evening. Margaret and I have had a lot of fun putting this program together. Thank you for being so easy to work with, Margaret. And now Margaret will tell you a little bit about Thoreau Farm, as well as introduce our panelists. Thank you very much. And again, thank you for being here.
Hello, as Charlotte said, I'm Margaret Carol Bergman, Executive Director of Thoreau Farm, birthplace of Henry David Thoreau. Speaking on behalf of the panel, I'd like to thank Charlotte and the Nancy R. Chandler Visiting Scholar Program for hosting us tonight. Also, Charlotte, we want to thank our friend Marjorie Merritt, who helped to underwrite The Great Tide of Humanity. And as you said, Marjorie is a woman of great vision and passion. For a long time, she has spoken about her desire to share her love of Henry and the Transcendentalists with her friends and colleagues in her adopted hometown of Bend. But most of all, we want to thank you in the audience for joining us tonight. I am Zooming with you from the birthhouse of Henry David Thoreau on Virginia Road in Concord, Massachusetts. And here's a picture of the birthhouse. The Nipmuc people are the ancestral stewards of this land. Many of you might already know Henry from his work and are familiar with Walden, or Life in the Woods, Cape Cod, his journals, and his essays, most notably Walking, Slavery in Massachusetts, and Civil Disobedience. We'll be hearing more about civil disobedience tonight from one of our panelists. Concord is known as being home to two revolutions: the American Revolution of 1775, where the shot heard round the world was fired at the North Bridge, and the literary revolution in the 1830s that was sparked by the Transcendentalist writers. Both revolutions laid the groundwork for our democracy and helped to create the American identity. Well, that's what we say in Concord anyway. Henry was the only member of that famous 19th century Transcendentalist circle of writers who was born in Concord. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Margaret Fuller, Louisa May Alcott, and her father Bronson Alcott were some of the writers who came together and created a community. They wrote their most notable works while living in this tiny town. As we will find out tonight, the Transcendentalists of Concord were also politically active, confronting many of the same social issues that we are facing today. Our first panelist is historian and writer Richard Smith. Richard has lectured on and written about antebellum United States and 19th century American literature. He has worked as a public historian in Concord for 21 years, specializing in Henry David Thoreau, the Transcendentalists, the anti-slavery movement, and the Civil War. So let me put Richard on the stand.
Good evening, Margaret, and good evening to everybody who's watching us this evening. Welcome to Concord, Massachusetts. Concord has had a long history of being involved with rebels and radicals. Of course, the American Revolution started here on April 19th, 1775. And throughout the 19th century and even into the 21st century, we've always had radicals and rebels being attracted to or growing up in our town. Perhaps one of the most well-known radicals of his time was Henry David Thoreau. And this is a little bit about him and his civil disobedience. The story is well known. In July of 1846, while walking into Concord from his Walden Pond house to have a shoe repaired, Henry Thoreau was stopped by Constable Sam Staples and asked to pay his poll tax for the year. When Thoreau refused, as a protest against the Mexican War and the issue of slavery, Staples arrested the 29-year-old and put him in the Concord jail for, as Thoreau later wrote, a novel and interesting night. It would have surprised nobody in Concord that Thoreau had taken an anti-slavery stand. He did, after all, come from an abolitionist family. Since his mother and sisters were quite vocal in their Garrisonianism, it was only natural that Henry would also believe in the motto, "No union with slaveholders," and this meant no paying of taxes. Thoreau would spend one night in the Concord jail. He would be released the next morning because the tax was paid, not by him, but by someone else, probably his Aunt Maria Thoreau. He then returned to his home at Walden Pond and then went on a huckleberry picking expedition with some friends, quote, "on one of our highest hills and where the state was nowhere to be seen." There is a story that many of you have probably heard that Ralph Waldo Emerson visited Thoreau while he was in jail. When he saw his young friend behind bars, he asked, "Henry, why are you in jail?" Thoreau cheekily replied, "Waldo, why are you not in jail?" And that's a really great story, but it never happened. In fact, Emerson knew nothing of Thoreau's arrest until the next day after Thoreau had been released. Because of this experience, Thoreau went on to write an essay that has become one of the most influential political works in American literature. The essay that eventually became known as Civil Disobedience went through several incarnations before it was published in 1849. Although his incarceration occurred while he was living at Walden, the lecture about his jailing was not started by Thoreau until after he left the pond in 1847. Many of you know he lived at Walden for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. Naturally, friends and fellow townspeople were curious about his night in jail and the reasons why he was arrested in the first place. Once Thoreau had moved out of his Walden Pond house and into the home of Ralph Waldo Emerson in October of 1847, he began working on a lecture about his jailing and the reasons behind his action. On January 26, 1848, H.D. Thoreau of Concord spoke at the Concord Lyceum on the relation of the individual to the state. We don't know exactly how the people of Concord reacted to this lecture. The only review we have is from the Journal of Bronson Alcott. In it, he wrote that Thoreau's lecture was, quote, "an admirable statement," and that, quote, "an attentive audience heard Henry's pertinent, well-considered, and reasoned statement." Now, Bronson Alcott's enjoyment of the lecture is no surprise. He himself had been jailed in 1843 for non-payment of taxes while he had been protesting slavery. And this action no doubt influenced Thoreau to do the same thing 3 years later. On February 16, 1848, about a month later, Thoreau again spoke on his jailing before the Concord Lyceum, this time in a lecture that he called "The Rights and Duties of the Individual in Relation to the State." This was not simply a repeat of the lecture that he had given 3 weeks earlier. Instead, it was probably an expanded and revised version of the earlier lecture. Alcott was again in the audience at this second lecture, and Thoreau later reported in a letter to Emerson, who was away in England, that Alcott was satisfied over the lecture. The following year, in the spring of 1849, Thoreau was contacted by Elizabeth Peabody, the famous educator, transcendentalist, reformer, publisher of The Dial, and asked if Thoreau would submit his lecture for publication in her new periodical, which she was calling Aesthetic Papers. Thoreau reluctantly agreed. I say reluctantly because he was working on the proofs of his first book at the time, and he was really kind of annoyed that he had to go away from that in order to send Miss Peabody some kind of a lecture. But he did it. And the essay saw print for the first time on May 14th, 1849, under the new title, Resistance to Civil Government. Now, the essay, much like the magazine itself, was barely noticed by anyone except a few of Thoreau's friends. There were 2 reviewers of Resistance to Civil Government. One reviewer said that Thoreau was crazy, And the other one said that if he didn't like America, he should move to France with the rest of the Red Republicans. And those are the only reviews that we have of Resistance to Civil Government. Although Henry Wadsworth Longfellow read it and he thought it was very good. As it turned out, the premier issue was the only issue of aesthetic papers, and Resistance to Civil Government died a quick literary death and remained obscure for the rest of Thoreau's life. After Thoreau's death in 1862, Resistance to Civil Government appeared in an 1866 collection of writings called A Yankee in Canada, with anti-slavery and reform papers. This was the first time that the essay was published under the title that we now know it, Civil Disobedience. It's not known where the title Civil Disobedience came from. It's not in any of Thoreau's writings at all. I'm thinking that it was more than likely an editorial decision made by the publishers, Ticknor and Fields. The essay slowly gained popularity throughout the 20th century and has since become one of Thoreau's signature works. It was widely cited by revolutionaries such as, this is like a who's who of radicals, Leo Tolstoy, Mahatma Gandhi, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And they all said that the essay was influential to their philosophies and their ideals. Today, of course, it is considered one of the most influential political essays in the history of American literature. And in fact, I would dare say, and I'm probably biased, but I would say that Civil Disobedience is perhaps the most radical political statement ever to come out of Concord, Massachusetts.
Thank you, Richard. Next, I'd like to introduce Tammy Rose. Tammy is an award-winning playwright, and for the past several years has been writing and performing plays about Henry David Thoreau and the Transcendentalists in and around Concord. In 2019, her play, Thoreau Twain, Brothers on the River, was performed at the Thoreau Society's annual gathering and was brought to the Samuel Clemens Conference in Hannibal, Missouri. Tammy?
Hi, everyone. Let me go back to sharing my screen. Can you see? Here, hang on. Let me try that again. It's trying to be so elegant and easy. All right. All right, there we go. So tonight, my topic is specifically on anti-slavery societies, both in Concord and beyond. I want to show you that Thoreau was not alone in his beliefs at the time, but that he grew up within a context of a community and a nation that was grappling with this huge issue of equality. I'm going to start with a quote by Lydian Emerson. That's her and her little boy. He's also someone who will grow up to witness and be influenced by these events. Her husband, Ralph Waldo Emerson, had just given a speech at the 75th anniversary of the start of the Revolutionary War in April of 1850. And she wrote, "How can we celebrate the victories of Concord and Lexington, quote, without denouncing our national shame in standing on the neck of the enslaved Black man while we shout aloud in praise of freedom and pretend to love it on principle?" She meant that somewhat metaphorically 170 years ago, but it obviously still resonates with what our country is still struggling with today. The murder of George Floyd reminds us that history is still all too present. Back then, the crucial moment was when the Fugitive Slave Act went into effect in that very year of 1850. That was when the rubber hit the road. Before that, the issue of slavery was theoretical for lots of Northerners, but the law literally brought it home for many. If someone in need showed up at your doorstep, would you help a fellow human, or would you send them into a life of unimaginable slavery? And this law stated that anyone helping an escaped enslaved person would be subject to 6 months of jail, a $1,000 fine, and that's about $31,000 in today's money. Officers were given large rewards for catching and bringing people of color to the South, even if it could not lawfully be proven that they were never enslaved in the first place. Records show that even people of color who had been living in freedom for decades were captured and sent south. No person of color was safe, and no white person could remain neutral. So slavery within the British Empire was ended within 15 years of the British Anti-Slavery Society being founded. Within 10 years, there was legislation, and on August 1st, 1838, complete abolition of slavery happened in the British West Indies. It's still celebrated as Emancipation Day. And this was an example to Americans that it could be done and helped to formalize the anti-slavery movement in America. But obviously the path would be different. So I'm not sticking to a strict chronology as I talk, so I wanted to give you some anchor points. So again, there's 1823, where the British Anti-Slavery Society was founded, 1833, where the process of emancipation was happening, 1837, the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society, and I'll get to that in a minute. 1840, the World Anti-Slavery Convention and Society was formed. 1846 was when Thoreau was arrested. That's a callback to what Richard was talking about. 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Act, and of course, the Civil War begins in 1861. Now, to talk about the World Anti-Slavery Convention, the American Anti-Slavery Society was formed 7 years before in response to that British West Indies proclamation and society. By 1840, there were 2,000 societies in America and beyond, and this convention was an attempt to unite them and form a united front. And notice where the women are in this picture, and the very few men of color, and see if you can even find a woman of color. Some societies were organized and run by men. Some of the societies were exclusively female, and very few had any people of color. Obviously, some of these groups were problematic in ways that we can clearly articulate today. Women were not even allowed to be in positions of power in the male-run societies, and were not even allowed in all the anti-slavery groups, which led to them creating their own female anti-slavery societies. The vote for white women was still a long way off, and for women of color, it was even longer. The groups in Boston and Concord would be integrated, and ironically enough, that was very rare. In Salem, they had an anti-slavery society made up only of women of color. This convention was famous for the freedoms that it didn't offer, because the American delegation essentially forced their women to sit in the back of the room, all the way in the back of this picture. And that brings us to the birth of the women's movement and a crossover with women's rights. That World Convention was where Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Lucretia Mott, which actually led to Seneca Falls, the first women's rights convention. Excuse me. That happened 10 years later. Women are literally realizing their limits and the extent of their power. They can't have roles of leadership in societies controlled by men, yet they are the ones who will become leaders in the fight to win over that society. William Lloyd Garrison, the prominent abolitionist, said, "The destiny of the slaves is in the hands of the American women, and complete emancipation can never take place without their cooperation." Margaret Fuller said in her book, Women in the 19th Century, "Knowing that there exists in the minds of men a tone of feeling towards women as towards slaves." So this is literally where you can begin to see the anti-slavery movement and mostly white women's movements separating in this pull and realization of power. African-American women are still getting lost in the shuffle, but they are learning how to fight. And Nikki, one of our next speakers, will discuss that in a few moments. So the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society, it started in 1837, and it started with just 2 or 3 women getting together, talking about it. But when they officially organized, it actually had 70 charter members. The title from tonight actually comes from the minutes of a meeting where they realized that their goal was to do not a little towards swelling that great tide of humanity, which is finally to turn our world of sin and misery into a world of purity, holiness, and happiness. So eventually the membership included, but was not limited to, Lydian and her daughter Ellen, Abigail Alcott, She's in that picture that's a little bit brownish. And also Louisa May Alcott, the Thoreau women, whom Beth will talk about in a little while and who are behind me. And it was not Sophia Hawthorne. She actually ended up making fun of the society in several circles. The last photo that we have there is meant to represent Susan Garrison, but this is only a representation of her image. We don't actually have a photo of her for many obvious reasons. There's not a lot of documentation, unfortunately, of African Americans, but however, in Concord, we have a marvelous house called the Robbins House, which is very well documented in terms of ownership and the family that lived there. And Susan Garrison was one of the matriarchs of that family. And as they say, as the daughter and wife of previously enslaved men, Susan signed petitions against slavery, the slave trade, the annexation of Texas, and the removal of the Cherokees from their homeland in the southeastern United States. She likely helped found the first African Baptist church in Boston. Susan passed this legacy of activism on to her children. And then also, what were these groups actually like? What did they do? One of the biggest things they did was to share information, to sign petitions, to engage in fundraising for formerly enslaved people. They brought in guest lecturers to the town, which already had a strong contingent of star readers. They shared newspapers and clippings. And just to let you know how important that piece was, sharing any literature or even talking about it was actually considered punishable by death in Louisiana. If you were talking, even in private conversation, about anything having to do with anti-slavery, you could be arrested, fined, and yes, sent to death. Louisa May Alcott actually organized this evening of performances. This happened 10 years before she wrote Little Women. So, and Thoreau appears again. These female societies didn't necessarily exclude men as speakers or participants. He appears documented during 2 Emancipation Day events, where Henry rings a bell to make sure that everybody in town goes to see when Emerson finally gives his anti-slavery speech, and actually decides to make a stand. He had been very reticent before that. And also Henry allows a celebration to actually happen at his Walden cabin. And finally, about the Underground Railroad. So Edward Emerson, that little boy that was in the first picture, he interviewed Anne Bigelow and many other Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society members when he grew up, because not a lot of illegal activity was actually documented in the 1850s. So Mr. Nathan Brooks and Mr. Waldo Emerson were afraid of committal, as I had just mentioned. We women, never. They must obey the law. And about the 1850s, she said, nearly every week, some fugitive would be rewarded with the utmost secrecy to Concord to be harbored overnight. That might be an exaggeration. There might not have been somebody every single week in Concord, but there were plenty of events, and there are several documented cases. And it was this network of women who were running the households that had to find safe places for these formerly enslaved people to provide food and shelter for them. The Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society helped push forward progress in both private and public realms. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. That quote by Lydia and Emerson, I hate to put you on the spot. Could you recite that again? Because I was trying to write it down, but I couldn't write fast enough.
Oh, absolutely. So without denouncing our national shame in standing on the neck of the enslaved Black man, while we shout aloud in praise of freedom and pretend to love it on principle. I can put that in the chat as well.
That would be wonderful. Thank you. Next is Beth Van Duzer. Beth is the general manager of Concord Tour Company, an educator at the Concord Museum, a licensed tour guide for the town of Concord, and is currently pursuing her master's in public history from Southern New Hampshire University. Beth?
Hi there. Can everyone hear me? All right. So I'm going to talk about the Thoreau women. The first women to settle in the American colonies were alewives, farmers' wives, tradesmen's wives, and mothers. These brawny women worked alongside their male counterparts to survive. On Sunday, men and women of the American colonies took a break from their work and attended church for 6 hours. It should be no surprise that women were first called upon to help others through their place of worship, the only social activity they had during the week. During the Revolutionary era of America, there were many organizations for and by women, such as anti-tea leagues and spinning bees. Women originally were asked to take part in reform movements. Eventually, women started creating their own movements. It was the involvement of women that allowed these later movements to be successful. Therefore, it should be of no surprise that Henry David Thoreau and his sisters, Sophia and Helen, became involved in reform movements. Growing up, Henry and his sisters were influenced by bold and brazen women that were unafraid to take a stand. They chose to take action on causes that were important to them, setting the path for Henry and his siblings. We can start with the maternal grandmother, Mary Jones Dunbar Minot. She had 14 brothers and no sisters. Growing up, the Thoreau children listened to this grandmother tell them daring stories of her and her loyalist family. One such story was how their grandmother carried ripe cherries to her brother in the Concord jail, the same jail Henry would make famous years later. She allegedly secreted knives or small files to her brother that allowed him to cut the grates and escape. Grandma was a talker, which was a skill that helped her after her first husband's death. As a widow, Grandma ran a tavern in Keene, New Hampshire, out of her home. It was on the main road with lots of traffic. It was here that Henry's mother, Cynthia, waited tables, learned how to manage a house and a business at a time when mostly only men did so. It was also where the grandmother met her second husband, married him, and moved to Concord. Moving on to Mom, Cynthia Dunbar Thoreau. She was just as brave as the grandmother. She was vivacious, intelligent, and a great talker. After the move to Concord, Cynthia, like so many colonial women before her, sought out community service. Joining the Concord Charitable Society, an organization of women that met to sew clothing to give to the less fortunate in town, was a way for Cynthia to meet women in town and become a part of the community. Eventually, she and her daughters helped co-found the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society and hosted meetings of the organization in their home. The oldest of the four children was Helen. She was a bookish woman. She was described as elegant and quiet. Although, as historian Robert Gross writes, Helen was so quiet and retiring that she figures little in reminiscences of the Thoreau clan. Helen, nonetheless, had the self-confidence to stake out a public presence in the abolitionist movement. Helen never veered from her commitment to anti-slavery. She signed petitions. She joined the Middlesex County Anti-Slavery Society and was a founding member of the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society. She held officer positions in both of the anti-slavery organizations. However, her most memorable contribution was the fact that she created anti-slavery scrapbooks that still exist today. Helen would let the various publications pile up in her home, then grab her scissors and paste and create an anthology of anti-slavery articles. It was Helen who decided literally which articles made the cut and were placed in the scrapbook. The anti-slavery scrapbooks were most likely intended to be circulated among the members of the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society. Within the scrapbook at special collections in the Concord Free Public Library, Helen has articles from 1841 to 1843, including articles on Frederick Douglass's first public appearances before anti-slavery audiences, as well as the trial and release of the Amistad captives. The scrapbook was originally a ledger that had been used by another Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society member's father for recording information of enslaved people. So Helen covered up the records of commerce with anti-slavery articles. For anyone interested in seeing some of Helen's scrapbooks, they are available on archive.org from Middlebury College. The one from the Concord Public Library is not digitized, but the Middlebury College ones are. So finally, it is said that the youngest daughter, Sophia Elizabeth Thoreau, had her mother's wit and her father's sweetness. She was often referred to as Henry in skirts, not because she physically resembled him. It was because they had the same voice, behaviors, interests, and wit. Sophia learned botany from the boarder, Prudence Ward, in addition to learning about Ward's anti-slavery crusade. It is well known that the Thoreau family supported John Brown, and in fact, Sophia and her mother donated $5 for Captain John Brown. We also know that at an 1844 anti-slavery convention, Sophia voted in favor of disunion. The Thoreau women, Cynthia, Helen, and Sophia, were radical in their belief of no union with slaveholders. So what is the influence on Henry? In 1837, when Henry returned from Harvard, he found his home abuzz with women with a purpose to tackle the crisis of slavery. Henry immediately jumped into the cause alongside his mother and sisters. In 1845, when a rainstorm forced the move of the annual August 1st anti-slavery celebrations indoors, it was Henry that rang the church bell at First Parish to alert folks that it was time to listen to the orations of Frederick Douglass as well as Ralph Waldo Emerson. The following year, August 1st, 1846, Henry hosted the August 1st festivities at Walden. Henry also helped escort individuals seeking emancipation along the Underground Railroad. Henry was influenced by the women in his life, and he embraced it. The Thoreau women made an impact in anti-slavery and on Henry by taking action. It does not matter if the reform movement grew out of a social or religious need. What mattered was taking action and standing by their principles when others did not see the use in doing so. The Thoreau women found their own way to contribute to the struggle for equality, and Henry happily joined them. Thank you. Margaret, you're muted.
Thank you, Beth. It's so interesting. I'd like to, I think it might be time before I introduce our next speaker that we sort of give some definition to what Transcendentalism is. And I'm going to ask Richard to do that.
Well, okay, we've got about 5 hours, right?
No, about 3 minutes, because I do want to introduce Nikki, but I want to put it in some kind of context.
Transcendentalism is the idea that we human beings are part of the universe. We are part of the bigger picture. Transcendentalism was a spiritual movement from the mid 1830s until the early 1840s. And they were all spiritual people. Most of them came from the Unitarian background. It's the idea that we come from a divine source. Call it God, call it Buddha, call it Krishna, call it Christ, whatever you want to call it. That divine spark, Emerson called it the oversoul, is within us. It's also in all of nature. So we must transcend our senses and be aware that we are part of the universe. Best way to do that for most of these people like Thoreau and Emerson was to go into the woods and commune with nature. Because when you're in the midst of nature, you're in the midst of God. And when you're in the midst of God, you are, as Emerson would say, part and particle of the universe.
Okay, thank you. So we'll get back to that later on in tonight's discussion, but I thought it was important to put it into context. So our next speaker is Nikki Turpin. Nikki is a teacher and the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Chapel Hill Chauncey Hall in Waltham, Massachusetts. She has a long-held passion for African American history and recently presented at the Association of African American Museums, discussing the importance of telling the full stories of African American female suffragists. So Nikki, you're on.
Thank you, Margaret. Hi, welcome. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. So as many people have already mentioned, this family, the Garrison family, one of my favorite members of the Garrison family is Ellen Garrison. She was born in 1823. She was born in Concord, Massachusetts, at a time where slavery was very firmly established in the US, and she was the granddaughter and daughter of formerly enslaved men. So she basically much spent her lifetime fighting for liberty and equality for all people and rights for all people. And she pretty much took a trip from Concord to Pasadena for her lifespan. In every stop that she made sure to also be part of the fight for equal justice for all. And so in her beginning years in Concord, her family is settled in, and she's pretty much thinking like, okay, I want to be a part of this community. So she decides school is where she wants to be, and she's part of the Concord public school system, and she is a student with flying colors. Her teachers commented continuously that she was going through books faster than they were able to give them to her. But when she was 12 years old, she decided to go to a parade, and she was actually ill-treated, is the quote, and crowded out during the Concord procession. And she felt humiliated, and her mother felt that she was humiliated, to the point that she did not want her child to go back to this parade. And so when the bicentennial celebration happened in 1835, her mother told her no. And it was only with the friend hand of Abba Prescott walking through the parade was she allowed to actually go. So once again, seeing that there was an ally next to her to allow her to have a place and be welcomed was part of the initiative, her seeing how important it was to get equal rights going. But also Susan Garrison being her mother and a founding member of the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society, Ellen clearly saw her mother fighting for rights, and she knew that this was part of her. This was part of her genetics almost. And so the next year when she was 15, Ellen took up the cause of another oppressed group, the Cherokee Indians, who were being forcibly removed from their ancestral home in Georgia. So with her mother, her sister, and around 200 other Concord women, Ellen signed petitions and sent them to Congress and protesting this act. And she also decided in that moment probably that petitioning was part of her life. It's what she was going to do to make change happen. And so her advocacy leads her to Boston and connecting with a lot of Black abolitionists in Boston. As you heard before, her mother was part of the African American Church in Boston. O.B. Robbins, who's a family member, also was a part of starting this church. So she was able to place herself in the African Baptist church scene, which meant she was meeting people from all over and not just having white allies, but African American allies and abolitionists hand in hand with her. So throughout the 1840s and 1850s, Ellen participated in a variety of abolitionist campaigns, and she signed petitions urging for an end of racial segregation in Boston schools and demanding a low bar bearing of Jim Crow cars on the railroads. And in 1851, she donated to the Boston Vigilance Committee to support the rescue of fugitive slaves. And then I think it's the next slide. And so with this leads her to say, there's another place for me to go. There's more work for me to do. She was actually quoted as saying, I have a great desire to go and labor among the freedmen of the South. I think it's our duty as a people to spend our lives in trying to elevate our own race. And from that, and with that idea, she decided to teach in Newport, Rhode Island. And then she decided, oh, I'm gonna go to Maryland and Virginia. And so Ellen spent a lot of her time being enthusiastic about teaching and education, which I totally relate to as a teacher myself. And this idea that one can better themselves only through education, only through the ability to read and write and be able to answer for themselves. And she wanted to be the reason people were able to actually do that. And in a letter to the AMA, Ellen expressed her enthusiasm by saying the quote that I had previously just said to you. And so we can see that she knew the importance of education, but she also found it as something she had to do. She knew it was part of her mission in life. When she joined other women who were Black and white and Northern women for the efforts to send teachers for free people, she ended up becoming the most dedicated teacher for that group. And one of her employers actually said to her in warning, because she was so dedicated, it is unsafe to go out. That is for colored people, for they are stoned and driven about at the pleasure of the rowdies. I found out one thing about these people. If they attack you, be careful to stand your ground, and they will leave you. But if you run, they will follow. Really much not unlike what we're seeing right now, right? And so this connects to our stories, as you'll see, and we'll talk about later on. Ellen being Ellen, she hits Baltimore in 1866, and she's like, I'm going to challenge this first civil acts right. I'm going to see if people are going to hold it together like they said they were. And so herself and Mary C. Anderson were thrown out of a train station because they challenged the first civil rights. And so they were thrown out of the waiting room, and the Civil Rights Act had just been passed from Congress. So it is really clear that Ellen is ready to take charge and also ready to call people out for not, as I like to say, making law action, right? There's a difference between it being law and being action. And Ellen was definitely one of those people who's like, I'm going to hold you to it. And so in this moment, we see that. And Ellen and Mary C. Anderson actually sue the railroad company for discrimination. And so a lot of people like to say she's the first Rosa Parks, but I like to say she's the first Ellen Garrison. She's really taking steps in a way that women at that time were not feeling comfortable to do, in a way where her safety, her life was in jeopardy, but she knew it was her job, and she felt it was her job to challenge, to make sure that people had equitable rights. Sadly, as many a times in Maryland, the grand jury dismissed her case, but she kept going, and she kept deciding and kept choosing to continue education and to continue teaching freely newly freed people of color, so that they can elevate themselves. This finds her going and heading to Kansas in 1879, where she decides to pass the Kansas Teachers Act exam in 1879, and then she teaches in 2 different schools, and pretty much becomes a really strong part of the educational community, and it's strengthened. She decides to actually get married again. Yes, she got married before. It was kind of messy. We're not going to talk about it. But she gets married again. She becomes a leader in her community. She continues educating. She continues to support education, and really taking account for how students learn and standing up for the fact that they are equal. African-American students are equal to white students. She was constantly called out on, well, can they really be equal? Can they really read? Can they really do this arithmetic? And every report that Ellen ever filled out always wrote equal, which my heart loves, obviously. Her final years, really sadly, she was moved to Pasadena. She had contracted tuberculosis, and so she made the move to California because the air was considered to be better for people who were symptomatic of tuberculosis. And so in 1890, as the Southern states were revising the constitutions and disenfranchising and segregating African Americans, Ellen just moved. She was done. And the climate was way better for her in California. She ended up moving and settling into an area in Pasadena where 3 of John Brown's grown children actually left as well. John Brown has a great holiday tomorrow, I feel like. Richard, you want to talk about that for a hot second?
Yes, tomorrow is the anniversary of the raid on Harper's Ferry by John Brown. And some of us will be celebrating it in Concord. We'll talk more about it later, I'm sure.
So her final years, while sad, really did show that she had made this migration from the East Coast to the West Coast. And every place that she stepped, she left a legacy of education, right? In my eyes, her legacy is definitely there because of her need to make sure people could lift themselves up. She is currently right now buried in Pasadena Mountain View. They will not allow us to give her a headstone. As you can see, those 2 flags right there represent where her body is right now. Right next to her is her sister. And then next slide. And so how does that relate to today, right? I stand here as an African-American woman, proud of the women who came before me. I know I stand here because of them. They're all my ancestors. They are all part of the spirit, as we talked about a little bit before. And there's still this need to constantly keep working, right? And so there's this great quote from a show that I love, and the character's name is Hippolyta, and she said, "I feel like they found a smart way to lynch me without me noticing the noose." And so I put that quote there because I think it's really important for us to understand that African-American women are consistently fighting these fights. You know, we talk about the Black Panthers and people look at it from a place of activism in a negative way, but not people may really talk about the fact that Black Panthers began for education and health support for people of color, right? Educating the youth, making and providing food, and making sure people had childcare. And so when we lose track of why activism happens, we forget the message and what's important. And often that message is taking care of each other. However, African-American women have always been doing that, right? We have always taken care of others, and sometimes at the less of ourselves. Fannie Mae, she's tired, sick and tired of being tired. Like, there's a reason she's sick and tired, because every day she is working and no one is giving her that moment to have self-care. And she actually probably didn't want to take it because she knew this was too important to do. Shirley Chisholm, trying to make steps for women of color in political placements, right? She kept going, even when she kept having a door closed for her. So we're all looking at these places where you're trying to still get into, and we're trying to feel like we're comfortable, and we're being told you are being brought in, but are we, right? And are we just more comfortable with the restrictions, right? So that's where that quote really sticks out. And fast forward to today. And so we are looking at the Black Lives Matter movement and how that is being talked about as activism, and how it's being portrayed on our screens and on our phones and our hashtags, right? You know, and people really want to believe that July 2013 is when BLM started, but people are forgetting about Tulsa in 1921. People are forgetting about Rosewood in 1923. People are forgetting about Emmett Till in 1955. The Black Lives Matter movement was the Black Lives Matter movement then. It just didn't have a title, right? So what we're fighting for right now is not very different than what our ancestors have been fighting for. What we're actually seeing, though, is that people, white people, are understanding how systemic racism has affected an entire culture of human beings that didn't exist until 1619, when we were taken away and brought here. And so we're using the tools that we have been given. And there's a great quote that I have here. I'm going to read it, the larger quote for you, but it's those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who've been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are Black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to make our differences and make them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those who still define the master's house as the only source of support. And so I leave you with this one last quote from Toni Morrison, who I kind of love. And last year was really hard for me when she passed away. So true, the Black woman did the housework, the drudgery. True, she reared the children, often alone. But she did all of that while occupying his place on the job market, a place her mate could not get, or which his pride would not let him accept. And she had nothing to fall back on, not maleness, not whiteness, not ladyhood, not anything. And out of the profound dissolution of her reality, she may very well have invented herself.
Thank you, Nikki. I'm going to ask Charlotte to come back and join us for a moderated discussion. And if you have questions, please submit them to either the Q&A or the chat to all the panelists, and Charlotte and I will look through them.
Yes, thank you all so much. That was wonderful. We do have a question, and I welcome all of you all listening to please submit more questions. But one question that we have is, why can't there be a headstone for Ellen Garrison? Nikki, is that for you?
Probably, because I don't know if anyone else knows the answer. So we've tried, we've been talking about it, we thought about doing fundraisers, but every time we've tried to contact to see if we can actually get something there, it's kind of been ignored. And we don't know if it's because of who else possibly could be buried there and their association with, yes, tomorrow's big holiday, and like attention being brought there. So it's still really confusing as to why we can't. We just right now have a big no. That does not mean that we're still not fighting it. But for right now, that's what's, we don't have a clear explanation as to why.
Okay, great. Nikki, someone asked too if you could share your last two quotes. So maybe when you get a little break, if you could put that in the chat function. And let's see, Tim has a question. How are each of you motivated and encouraged by your knowledge of the history you presented? Nikki really took the lead on this topic. Does she have more to say?
I always have more to say. That's probably like the problem. But I can take it while you guys think. I'll give you guys processing time. Is that good? And I'll go since I was already there. Is that good? So I think I definitely become from this old school place of I can't further myself unless I know where I've come from. And that means the ugly, the beautiful, the joy, all of it, right? And so I'm constantly motivated by finding other people's legacies because I feel like once I do that, I'm actually continuing their legacy. And I think a lot about the Blackfoot Nation and how they think about legacy being a constant infant flow, right? It never stops. There's no shutdown. And so when I look at myself being really old now and thinking about, I'm on the other end of things, so to speak, what do I want to represent? What do I want to leave on that I seed and plant into all of my students, into my own child, into my own family? And so constantly hearing other people's stories and what they have left motivates me to continue telling their stories so they don't get forgotten. But then also hopefully, I know I will be forgotten, but what I stand for or what I stood for or what I have helped initiate won't be forgotten. So that's what keeps me going. And there's also something really great about touching something really old. I don't know if you guys, Richard, you could probably speak to this, Beth, I know you too, but when you hold something that someone from a moment held and was so important to them, it's almost like there's an energy transferred in that of like, wow, this is really important. And this is a part of that person's like being. And I get to like share, even though we are hundreds of years separated.
Yeah, as a historian, especially for the people that I study, the Transcendentalists, the abolitionists in particular, just being in Concord itself is kind of a big deal because I'm walking the same streets these people were walking, or I'm at Walden Pond, or I go by the homes that they lived in, or if I go into Boston, I see the home of people like Lewis Hayden and Charles Sumner, and so yeah, as a historian, I've always been attracted to the radicals and the troublemakers and the weirdos, and I think that it would be hard for me to be studying all of this stuff from the 19th century, but not make a connection with the 21st century, because a lot of the issues that these folks were dealing with in the 1850s are a lot of the same issues we're dealing with now. There's not a big difference between the fugitive slave law of 1850 and the immigration situation that was happening last year or the year before at the southern border, with just apprehending anybody that was considered an illegal alien. And so by reading a lot of these people and studying them, it's really easy for me to say, well, what would they be doing now? How would they be standing up to it now? And really, people like Thoreau and Charles Sumner and John Brown, they were white allies before we had the word white allies. Although Nikki taught me a better word, they were accomplices. And I consider myself an accomplice in the terms of the BLM movement and helping people of color and women and what things like that. So I don't like the idea where people think history stopped. In 1865, there are no more slaves. Well, that's not true. In 1865, there is no more racism. These things are things that we're still dealing with now. So for me as a historian, I need to bring it up to the present so that we can at least learn from what these people were trying to teach us 150 years ago.
Yeah, and to jump on what Richard said about how people think that history has sort of stopped or that it's frozen somehow in time. As a playwright, I'm always looking to revive the great moments of history, of things that we know, of people just going through their daily lives and then something larger happens. And I feel like I discovered the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society. I've been living near Concord for my whole life. And I think I really just discovered it maybe last year or the year before. And once I heard about these meetings, I really began studying it, and I was like, okay, wait, this is part of a larger movement, and it's even larger, and where does that really fit, and how do we fit into that, and how are we responding? And I feel like those are really great moments of drama that we can all bring together. And once I started on this topic, I just felt like I fell in love with the research, and I'm still researching it, and hopefully I'm gonna either do a play next year, or I'm gonna write a play and do it whenever the coronavirus is over, or get some of this into writing, and because I feel like we need to share this story, and this is a story that needs to be told.
Thank you, Tammy. Actually, someone did ask what's next for your stage, so.
I want to continue with a project like this, and I want it to be from anti-slavery to anti-racism, something that brings in what was happening in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, and what's happening now. So, yeah.
Great. And question for you, Beth. Could you talk about the Thoreau aunts? Do we know much about them as activists?
Oh, Aunt Mariah would not know. She was not an activist. She's really fun. She was a gossip. So if you wanted to know what was happening in town, you would look up and find Aunt Mariah and have tea with her. But Aunt Mariah was definitely not into the anti-slavery issue. Actually, when Henry is arrested, she goes, and they believe it is her that pays his poll tax that he doesn't pay, because she is aghast. It is horrified that her nephew's in jail for not paying his tax. He should have paid his tax. So yeah, no, they weren't with it.
Okay, and this is a question for all of you all. What does the panel think activists today can learn from the Transcendentalists to move their causes forward? Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, other than Transcendentalists themselves, I think the most important quote that I always come up with is, I think it was the 1870s or 1880s, a young man of color asked Frederick Douglass what to do. And Frederick Douglass said, agitate, agitate, agitate. And that's always in the back of my mind. And it's also, I think it's something that a lot of the folks, Thoreau, I think would totally agree with that. Certainly a lot of them, Emerson, a lot of the abolitionists from Boston and Concord, they would all agree with that idea of agitate, agitate, agitate. None of these people were ever at a loss for words, and especially when it came to social justice. And look, this may be blasphemous, but these are just people. As much as we admire them, and as famous as a lot of them are to us and to other people, these are just people doing their thing. They're trying to live their daily lives and take care of their families. And Thoreau wanted to go for his walks and write in his journal, but these outside forces are closing in on them, and they could either hide under their beds and ignore it, or get involved. And I think that, being the transcendentalists that they were, believing that all men and women are created equal, they had no choice but to be involved. And I think we can take that from them.
I actually think too that they would look at the people who are actually out there in the streets putting themselves at risk as doing the right thing, right? They would actually be on top of that in a way, and like encouraging that, because there's not been a single revolution that I know of that was peaceful, right? Nothing gained peacefully, right? I think is the term. And so I think they would actually be like, yes, like, let me give you your gold star. Let me help you, because you're doing the action. You're putting yourself out there to make an effective change happen. And everyone's doing their small parts, but I can see what you're doing. So I feel like they'd be like all about these people, like this young crew of people who are like out there every day. I feel like they'd be so behind them.
Yeah.
And I think it's so ironic that Henry's known for civil disobedience and at least starting revolutions in a peaceful way. And I feel like that's part of his legacy. But I also feel like, especially when it came to 1850 and John Brown, that he immediately decided, like, this is where we need to take it to the next level.
Well, even in civil disobedience, Thoreau says, a peaceful revolution, if any such thing is possible. So even he's questioning in the essay Civil Disobedience if a peaceable revolution can even be done. And I don't think he was really convinced that it could be.
Right, but I think it's so interesting that we always pick up how Gandhi and Martin Luther King, carried that on as a message of, well, at least start doing it peacefully. And one of the things in civil disobedience is to sort of throw a monkey wrench into the workings of government. And if you need to get yourself arrested, then that's going to take up resources of the police. And if you're not paying your taxes, then you're not literally greasing the wheels of the country. So I feel like there's definitely seeds, but I definitely see, also where the escalation can happen. And I think that civil disobedience, that's one of the reasons that it's, stood the test of time, because it's so, it describes a lot of these things. And even Thoreau gets, he gets up out of his chair and he does things in Concord and he makes it happen.
Well, look, we're American citizens. It's our right and our duty to stand up. If the government does something that we think is immoral, then it's our duty to stand up and let the government know that they're doing something immoral. I mean, it happened in Concord in 1775, and it happened in Concord in 1850, in 1851. And so, yeah. And
there were slave rebellions and Harper's Ferry and a lot of moments when America is just like, this, maybe it is going to be about disunion, maybe it's just going to be about protest, maybe it's going to be, we're going to drag somebody from the courthouse because the slave catchers have brought them into court and we need to rescue him. Shadrach Minkins. There's a whole story of how, people, there would be crowds, Anthony Burns, there would be crowds of people trying to do whatever they can to make sure that enslaved people were not brought back down south. And sometimes they were successful and sometimes they weren't.
Unmute yourself, Margaret.
We have a bunch of questions coming in. So one of them is from Christina, who says she loves and appreciates learning about the details specific to time and location in history. The subject is familiar within the circle that I've chosen. How can we offer this information to people who aren't educated? For example, she's from Virginia, now living in Oregon, and unfortunately has racist family members in North Carolina. I do share sociological facts of history, but you have pulled together a lot of different aspects. So I guess the question is, how do you talk about race, have that uncomfortable subject about what's going on with family members who think differently than you do? Nikki, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, totally. So I often say to people, my race is not uncomfortable to me. I am a Black woman, right? And so it should not be uncomfortable to you. What should be comfortable is when the question is if I deserve equality with someone that looks like Richard or Beth or Tammy. The conversation is not about race and it's about equity, right? And so I can share, I have family members that I'm married into that don't believe that I'm necessarily equal to them because I'm a Black female. I correct them often, but it's a conversation that we have to continuously keep having because we as a country have never really talked about it, right? We had so many moments to have a real talk about race. And, when Bill Clinton was in office, he wanted to have an initiative to just discuss race. And that got completely sidetracked when Monica Lewinsky and him decided to have their fun time. So we never saw the country really talk about how has slavery, how has racism, how has systemic racism affected us as a country, and how do we fix that? And that just spiraled and changed to the point that we are here now where we are with who we are in office, and worried about our friends and our family who are people of color, who are BIPOC people. So it really is just, for me, when you're having that conversation, stating the facts. Like, here's an example, let's talk about this. Let me pull out this, let's talk about that. And really having people kind of own where their theologies come from, right? And most of the time people realize, oh, I don't know all the facts on that. And sometimes they'll be like, I'm completely pushing away. But the fact is that you've put that seed in their head. And so now they're going to continuously think about it. I think what we're seeing right now is a lot of people, a lot of white people, starting to realize I have to educate myself, right? I can no longer rely on an outside source to get me to the point to understand what a person of color is going through. I need to do this work, right? And it's courageous, you know, like a lot of people's like, oh, I read White Fragility. And I'm like, but you're not fragile. You have so much strength being a white person, because you have the ability to change, because of numbers, what is happening for us as a country, right? You actually have that ability. So there is nothing fragile about you. You can do this. We are all waiting for you to come on board and be an accomplice in this work. And that's really where it is, right? At the end of the day, you want to say, I left a legacy where I showed what side I'm on. I want equity for all people. So that's like my short, long answer. Also, someone asked what's my shirt on my shirt. These are the members of the Garrison House. So I like to wear them whenever I talk about them, because I feel like they're a little bit closer to me. So that's why I have that shirt on.
Okay, thank you, Nikki. Let's see, we have a question from Lauren. How important was the fundraising in Concord? The money that went to John Brown and the other efforts. I'm interested in how they raised money. Do we have any records?
Does anybody want to take this?
Well, I mean, I can take the first part about it if you want to talk about John Brown and the Secret Six.
Sure.
So the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society, as I mentioned, they did a lot of different things, including events. They sewed things. They took in sewing. The reason that I sort of made a joke about Sophia Hawthorne making fun of the society was that she said that they would do sewing for a really low price. So she was trying to take advantage of them as much as possible. And even Nathaniel Hawthorne was really not into the anti-slavery movement at all, to put it politely. But in general, they were working on whatever they could. Also, there was a lot of money taken in for the Vigilance Society as well. And that was sort of a movement of mostly men who would actually go out and make sure that the slave catchers were always being watched, and they sort of kept vigil over what was happening there. And so when enslaved people came through the Underground Railroad, they always wanted to make sure that they were well clothed and well fed, and that they also, you know, could take stuff with them. So that was part of where that money went. And there's a little bit of records. I've been reading the minutes of the society, and they have, the Concord Special Collections Library has some records. I haven't found all of them, but I think there's some. It wasn't a tremendous amount of money, but it was constant, and it was just a steady stream. So, all right. But if you want to talk about John Brown, Richard will tell you all about the Secret Six, because that's the exciting part.
So John Brown was in Kansas in 1855, 1856, when Kansas, they were fighting over whether or not Kansas was going to come into the Union as a free state or a slave state. And so he was very much involved in anti-slavery activities in Kansas. It was basically a mini civil war before the real Civil War in 1861, where the two sides were pretty much fighting it out with swords and guns and cannon. And so Brown came east twice, in 1857 and 1859, to raise money for his anti-slavery activities, which most people assumed was violence. So he was in Concord in 1857, and he lectured at the town hall. And at the end of his lecture, when he's talking about Kansas and bleeding Kansas and the fight against the border ruffians and the pro-slavery forces, he would ask for money. And then literally pass the hat. So in that time, I think Emerson gave him $25. Thoreau gave him a trifle, whatever that means. By the time he came back in 1859, he was still raising money, but the issues in Kansas had stopped or quieted down. And so he had other ideas about ending slavery, which of course led to the raid in Harper's Ferry. When he's here in 1859, he's still raising money for his anti-slavery activities. Whether or not people like Thoreau and Emerson knew it was for the raid on Harper's Ferry, we really don't know. But one of the people in Concord, Frank Sanborn, was a member of the Secret Six, who raised money and literally gave John Brown weapons for the raid on Harper's Ferry. So Brown himself was doing his own fundraising. He didn't raise a lot. I think for the raid on Harper's Ferry, he got like around $2,000 from the Secret Six. But he was just one of many anti-slavery people who was going around lecturing in order to raise money for anti-slavery activities. Whether or not the people in Concord knew it was going to be for violence, I think they had a pretty good idea, but nobody would really say that it was going to happen that way or not.
And since we're on the topic of John Brown, I'm actually just itching to mention The Good Lord Bird. It's a show on Showtime, a series, and I think it premiered last week or something, where Ethan Hawke is playing John Brown. And just to warn you, it's very entertaining. It's told as if it's Mark Twain style telling. It's a really interesting story. It's not entirely accurate. It kind of portrays him in, you just have to take it with a grain of salt. But anything that gets people into history, I'm definitely, and something that's in an entertaining way, I would say. So I wanted to offer that.
Thank you, Tammy and Richard. We have a question here from Emily. Both Gandhi and Dr. King and others practiced nonviolent, peaceful, civil disobedience and revolutionized the world. I'm not sure how you can say that peaceful protest hasn't accomplished anything. Is that what you meant? I was going to say Nikki or Richard, but I'll go to Nikki.
Okay, so I think it's really interesting how we talk about peaceful protests, right? And so that question kind of triggers that to me, in that at those times for Gandhi and Dr. King, no one thought that was peaceful. People thought sit-ins were rude. They thought marching was out of control. That narrative of peaceful is how we've changed how we tell history, right? Because we want to seem like we were welcoming of these changes for the brown man. But in fact, people were outraged that Dr. King was saying the statement of sit-in and, you know, boycott buses. Like, it was completely out of left field for most people. Similar to how people looked at Colin Kaepernick when he took a knee, right? That's a peaceful protest. He's not bothering anyone. It actually was kind of basically sanctioned by a Marine who said, if you really want to show respect, go back on the field, but take a knee like we do when we represent those who've passed for us. People were outraged. Think about how many people burned their Kaepernick jerseys. I can't even buy one now, but people burned Nikes because Nike supported him. So we really have to be careful about how we think about what peaceful meant, because back then that wasn't considered peaceful. Just like 20 years from now, people are going to say Kaepernick was peacefully protesting, and those crazy people of that time didn't respect it. And now look what has happened, right? So we have to be really careful about how we use that word. For us, it's peaceful. Looking back and thinking about just boycotting something, that's a peaceful way. But it's kind of a play on the language. And Richard and I kind of talked about this a little bit in January when we did a talk together, but we really have to think about how we viewed it then. And then for Dr. King and Gandhi, it was not peaceful.
Okay, anyone else on that topic? Okay, new question. I write about women's suffrage movement and the early connections between abolitionism and women's rights. Did any of the Concord women who spoke out against slavery also publicly participate in the later women's suffrage movement?
Yes. The short answer, yes. Lydia Emerson was an animal rights activist. She was anti-slavery. She was for the vote for women. You have the thorough women. It's everybody, except maybe Ellen Emerson, who actually gave a talk against women getting the right to vote. But everybody else was definitely, if they were in the anti-slavery movement, they were actually also in the suffrage movement. It just went on and on. Tammy, anything else?
I actually wanted to bring in Margaret Fuller, just because I started reading her, and I was thinking about why she wasn't more prominent in the anti-slavery movement. And of course, it's because she ended up moving to Italy in the later part of the 1840s, and she passed away in 1850. But I would say that she was one of the most prominent people who were fighting for women to just have conversations with each other, and to just start having, women getting together in public, in a public forum. Elizabeth Peabody's bookshop in Boston, for instance, she held conversations there, and she was a member of the Concord Society, and she's always one of my favorites. So I want to stick her in there.
Well, and the Alcotts, they never met a reform they didn't like. They were involved with just about everything from educational reform to anti-slavery to women's rights. And a lot of these women, not just the Concord women, but women all around the country, they really kind of cut their teeth, their radical teeth, in the anti-slavery movement. So then once the Civil War ended, and the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments have been passed, a lot of these women said, okay, well, everything that we just learned for the last 25 years in the anti-slavery movement, let's use those tactics for the women's rights movement. And which there were a lot of issues. There were anti-slavery women who said, well, let's worry about the Black people first, then we'll worry about the women. Whereas people who were trying to combine both women's rights and anti-slavery, they got a lot of grief for it, because you can't do one, before you finish the other one, and so after the Civil War, a lot of these women said, okay, well, now it's our turn. And a lot of the tactics, the petition writing and the marching in the streets and the protests and giving lectures, that was stuff they had all learned from the anti-slavery movement in the 1840s and 1850s. So they kind of took that and really ran with it. And a lot of the women, like Louisa Alcott, was absolutely involved in the women's rights movement. She's the first woman to vote in Concord in 1879, and took great pride in that fact. And it really bothered her that she could not get other women as fired up as she was about voting. It bothered her a lot. So yeah, the Alcotts definitely were involved. If there was a reform, the Alcotts were going to be involved in it in a lot of ways.
I guess you could say that that the suffrage movement was built on the abolition movement, and I wonder about the Black Lives Matter movement. I've heard some people, comedians, but I mean, no, like serious comedians, say that it's been hijacked by white women, and I wonder if this is, to what end this will come to. Will we be talking about feminism again, as with abolition to the suffrage movement? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I just wanted to say in history, like Richard was right in terms of like the anti-slavery movement had you know, I don't think that it was so much that one thing built on another as much as it was just this cycle. And I think that it's always been problematic in situations where people are realizing how little power they have. I think it's really sad to realize how they try to consolidate, because a lot of the early women's suffrage movement was about leaving Black women behind. And even nowadays, there are all these issues of intersectionality where people with disabilities, you know, get left behind in a lot of the conversations. Because we keep pushing forward towards equality, so I don't think it is going to be back to just feminism. It's going to be back to, wait a minute, we don't live in an equal society, and educating people about that and making people understand why you know, how some people don't have as much power, or you know, are just like, they don't have the freedom that other groups do.
Does anybody want to add anything? Okay, we have time for one more question. Charlotte's going to give us the hook soon. And let's see, this is from Tim. The rebel spirit seems very much alive right now, but people are motivated by very different philosophies and worldviews. What can the Transcendentalists and their female family members teach us about coming out on the right side of the argument to abolish slavery? I'd like to just say that the females were also Transcendentalists too. It just wasn't men. So it was everyone in the circle that we're talking about. Beth, did you want to?
What's the
speak
question?
to part of this?
So how did women affect and Transcendentalists affect?
How did what did the women do to contribute to abolition?
They weren't afraid to act. I mean, really what comes down to is that the women, they come from a long line usually of women that were brazen and they were willing to stand their ground. And they had a circle around them. So the sphere that existed in Concord, you had Emerson and you have Thoreau and you have their families, and they all work together and they are all putting this forth together. So they have a network of people that are supporting them. And that's really what helps, is that you have a support network. And that's why people like Margaret Fuller show up and other people, because this is a place where it's safe to have these different ideas and people help you build them as opposed to tearing you down for them. So anyone?
Richard?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is that really in both, especially the Emerson and the Thoreau family, and even to a certain degree the Alcott family, it was the women who were pushing the guys to do stuff. Lydia and Emerson was the radical abolitionist of the Emerson family. Thoreau had no choice. He had to be an abolitionist because he had mom and his two sisters. And abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison were always staying at their house. Abigail Alcott came from a long line of abolitionists in Boston. And I think she and Bronson Alcott were really complementing each other when it came to reform movements, and they passed that on to their daughters. So, you know, and like William Lloyd Garrison said, it was really the women who were the backbone of the anti-slavery movement. And that's really evident in Concord history, because it's the women who are kind of pushing the guys to do stuff. It was Lydia who was pushing.
I'm gonna have to hop in because we're nearing our end of our time here. And I want to thank Charlotte and for hosting us tonight. And I want to say quickly, if you have any questions, let Charlotte know and she'll give them to us. And there were a lot of questions about resources, and we'll answer those and we'll send them out to you in an email as well. So I'm going to hand it back over to our host, and thank you very much, Charlotte.
Yes, thank you all so much. That was fabulous. And I think we could go on for hours and hours, but we want to, as we said, we want to respect everyone's time and end at 6 o'clock. We will be sending out an email to all of you that were registered tomorrow that are registered. The email will go out tomorrow and it'll have a link to this whole discussion. And as Margaret said, some of the questions that we did not get to answer, we'll try to pull together some resources. If we can't do that by tomorrow, expect an email from us maybe mid next week with some of those resources about different books for education and that kind of thing. So I just want to thank everybody. I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank Marjorie Merritt again for bringing us all together and introducing us. And I want to thank all of the participants from all parts of our world that participated today. It's pretty amazing to learn about this history and how it really does relate to everything that's still going on today. So just thanks again for being here. I appreciate all of you. Take care.